en Mía Voces Activas hablaremos con la subsecretaria de la Oficina de las Naciones Unidas para la Reducción de Riesgos de Desastres, Mami Mizutori. Ella nos habla sobre las políticas públicas para la prevención de desastres en la región latinoamericana y del Caribe, así como su trayecto desde Japón hasta ser parte del sistema de las Naciones Unidas.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. And on the first question, I was born in Japan at a time when, let's say, women's opportunities were not that much. I think women in general struggled, girls and women, to get a career, to become a professional. Luckily, after I graduated from university, I entered the Foreign Ministry of Japan. And I stayed there for almost 30 years. I got the opportunity to work in many different countries, including Spain, Mexico, United States, and then also United Kingdom. After that, I decided to change my career path a bit. I went to the United Kingdom, and there I worked at a university running an institute about Japanese arts and cultures, which was a very interesting experience, changing from government to the non-profitable sector, where I stayed a few years. And then I got this opportunity to work for the United Nations, which for me was very important, because after serving in the non-profitable center a while, I thought if I can do something to make a change, working on a public service, a public good, that would be fascinating. I got this job to be the head of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and representing the Secretary General in this area of disaster risk reduction, which I believe passionately that is very important right now. So that's what brings me here. I think when I was appointed to this post, being the special representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, there was probably a backdrop that my own country, Japan, is very disaster prone. It's a country that has for centuries experienced earthquakes, tsunamis, volcano eruptions, but now also a lot of impact from climate emergency. And so we as Japanese, we grow up with the impact of disasters, and probably this makes me feel that yes, we as people can do much more in order to try to mitigate as much as possible the damage from disasters, so fewer people dying, fewer people losing their houses, fewer people losing their jobs. I think in a way that kind of thinking is embedded if you come from a country where disasters were always next to you. So, in a way, you cannot stop a cyclone from coming, right?
Yes.
Well, maybe in many, many years and decades, we can stop a bit more if we are successful in climate mitigation. But in the meanwhile, what can we do? One answer, prevent better. What does it mean? So, a disaster is a combination of three things. The hazard, let's say a cyclone. And the only way that we can mitigate the ferocity of a hazard like a cyclone is by mitigating the climate change better. But then you have the vulnerability, right, that I mentioned about. You have to understand where the vulnerable people are, whether there are women and girls, whether there are indigenous people, and sometimes it's a combination, right? Indigenous woman who is living with disability. You need to understand where they are and what their needs are. And in order to do that, the important thing is that you need to include their voices in the planning for prevention, in the planning for disaster risk reduction, because who knows about their predicament better than themselves? The third is that you need to have a robust governance system so that what is exposed, like a house, like an infrastructure, is as resilient as possible. And it has to be a legal arrangement so that builders, both public and private, who do not abide by these regulations are punished. Unless you do this, you will have assets exposed in a vulnerable way to disasters. I wanted to tell you that Panama is in the process of doing it. Just this year, the government, the president decided to create a cabinet for disaster risk reduction. And right now, the minister in charge of governance, Ministerio de Gobierno, she is in charge of this, and a plan, a strategy for disaster risk reduction of the national government is in the process of making. And we at UNDRR have been requested, together with all different UN system agencies, to support the government in making this strategy and also implementing it. So I think Panama is now in a very, very important and positive journey, and we are here to support the government's endeavor. So one thing that we campaign a lot, we use this word: nothing erodes sustainable development like disasters. This is very important related to your question, because I think you know about the Sustainable Development Goals, right? Yes. The 17, which starts with eradicate poverty, stop hunger. Now, with a disaster, poverty only increases. This pandemic, which is a terrible disaster, has pushed so many people back to poverty. So even if you put a lot of effort as a government, as a country, as a people, to move forward economic growth and eliminate poverty, with one disaster, if you're not preventing, if you're not prepared well enough, it can just set you back. So what you need to do is really make sure that disasters don't devastate, disasters that don't drive you back your development process to where you were a year ago, 10 years ago, even more. I think, it's very important for all of us to think about the future generations. I think, we have done enough damage as individuals, as groups, as corporates, in forgetting that we really have only one planet, and what the human beings over decades, centuries have been to the planet. Yes, it has allowed us to grow, it has allowed a lot of us to live in a better way, but it has come to a point where it is not sustainable. And we do need to think that the planet, as we always say, there's no planet B, and in order to make it sustainable, we need to change a lot of ways that we have come to appreciate the modern, way of life. I think, we can think about many different ways of how we live, how we work, how we connect with people that will make the world more sustainable. And I do believe that, young people are already thinking about that much more than people of my generation or older. And that's where I think, where the key on how can we be more sustainable lies. The good news is that the Women's International Leadership for Disaster Risk Reduction, which started in Asia Pacific 2 years ago, we have now created a network in Latin America as well last year. There are already 700 women who are associated, you may think that's not much, but I think, in a short time, a lot, yeah. And we really want these women to lead the agenda, so that gender inequality will not be a barrier for advancing disaster risk reduction, but at the same time, advancing the disaster risk reduction agenda with the knowledge and power of women will empower women, so that in the totality, inequality will be reduced. Women and girls are in general disproportionately affected, but if there are indigenous women, if there are women with disability, it becomes even harder. So we do need to bring in more women into this sphere, not as people to be protected, but as the leaders. We still have a long way to go, but I'm hopeful that it will happen. I do think that, the more I get older, I really feel that I'm very privileged. Where I was born, how I was raised, and whatnot. And the reason why I can do what I'm doing is not merely because I studied hard or worked hard. A lot of times it's where you're born, it's how you were raised that allows you to grow. And we know that a lot of people don't have that. Entering the UN system, I am more acutely aware of what it means when you say leave no one behind, because there are so many people left behind. Now, this is an enormous task, but I do feel that this is something that I want to keep on being engaged with, and I think it's an area where we all need to be more conscious of and do more about it.
Thank you very much for your time and for this interview, Ms. Mizutori.
You're welcome.